The ninth lesson looks at how Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. We're going to take it a reason-by-reason approach and sort of look at what is a relatively complex question in bits, because of course if you're going to be answering exam questions on this, you're going to have to look at it in bits and then eventually determine what was the primary reason or reasons for Hitler's ascendancy to the chancellorship of Germany in 1933. Now, the first reason is one we've already discussed, and in the context of the Great Depression, this will entirely transform the prospects of the Nazi Party. Just to recap a lot of the stuff we talked about last lesson, wage cuts for average workers, the fact that people had to keep their jobs or could keep their jobs that worked a short time. There was massive unemployment because many of the jobs just disappeared, which led, of course, to homelessness and poverty on a scale that Germans had never seen before. And perhaps this is the worst case of homelessness and poverty by contrast as a result of an economic crisis in history. The established Weimar parties, such as the SDP, will take a lot of the blame. You'll remember, of course, that the SDP drops out of government because they refuse to work with the budget of Chancellor Brüning. And as a result, it looks like these parties, who had been in power for so long, can no longer solve the issues in Germany. In desperation, voters changed their support to parties that had been the most critical of the Weimar coalition, such as the communists and the Nazis. Those people who blame them from the very beginning start to look like sages, if you will. People who come out and say, well, look, we knew it all along. We told you about these guys. And that message now makes sense, whereas during times of economic success, it did not before. This leads to massive electoral breakthrough for the Nazis, okay? In terms of seats in the Reichstag, okay, they're collecting at this particular point 4.5 million votes. Okay, now that makes them the third largest party in the Reichstag in 1930. They became, the second largest party. The communists became the third largest party in the Reichstag. The Nazis got more than 4.5 million votes. They got 6 million votes. So please excuse what I just did there. And this was in large part due to the fact that the unemployed started voting for both of these parties en masse. And there was a certain resonance that the Nazis had, which actually increased their lead over the communists. The second one is Nazi propaganda and electioneering. Okay, so in the context of the Great Depression, which are changing people's mind, the Nazis actually established a very good way of running elections, and they established, of course, and they had established a propaganda machine which supports them. The Nazis did use every opportunity in this time to attack coalition government, to criticize its inability to provide solutions, most notably their inability to provide basic housing and social welfare. And in this context, the Nazi propaganda machine gets out and working to its full capacity. The party message was spread. Thousands of posters, pamphlets, and newspapers drum out day after day after day attacks on the Weimar Republic and glorify the Nazi Party. Torchlit parades and mass rallies were held, which gave a sense of order and purpose and destiny to the Nazis. They mastered the elements of spectacle and pageantry, and they seemed to offer within this spectacle and pageantry a hope for a brighter, different future. And they also used modern technology. One of the sort of little side notes to all of this is Hitler, of course, is trying to become Chancellor of Germany, but he also runs for President of Germany in 1932. In 1925, you'll recall that Ebert dies, and he's replaced with General Hindenburg. Hindenburg, and all presidents for that matter, run a 7-year term, i.e. they win an election and they hold the position of president, or effectively head of state, for 7 years. That means in 1932, that time period for Hindenburg expires, and Hitler challenges Hindenburg for the presidency. He doesn't win. But, of course, it helps establish him as a national figure. He does poll quite well in some respects, but he doesn't really come close to winning. Hitler uses an airplane, and this is the first time a politician, to my knowledge anywhere in the world, had used an airplane. He'd speak in as many as 4 cities in one day, and this whole thing was revolutionary. It showed him as dynamic, it showed him as cool, and of course, the Nazis play on that. Take a look at this poster here on the right, Hitler über Deutschland, which means Hitler over Deutschland, and it shows Hitler flying around in a plane literally sprinkling Germany with swastikas. Also, too, on the left, you see the type of propaganda that really goes after the the sort of the downtrodden worker, our last hope, Hitler, really shows that, you know, amongst all of it, you have Hitler, who is perhaps a savior. And the Nazi propaganda machine is quite an effective tool for getting the Nazi message out there. Plus, it shows Hitler as dynamic, new, exciting, the change people need in the time of economic crisis. The third reason is the Nazis give many Germans a sense of traditional order amid the chaos. And this is something I've alluded to previously. The Nazis versus communism dynamic is important. The Depression will boost the fortunes of the Communist Party. At 4.5 million votes, is the third largest party. They argue, okay, the communists do, that the roots of the problem of Germany was with the capitalist system. And of course, their argument, though, you know, very different than Nazis, plays into the hands of the Nazis. The Nazis will pose as a strong defender of the existing traditional, stable German order, or at least the one that existed before the First World War. The communists against this are portrayed as scheming revolutionaries. They're in league with the Jewish community. They tap into a latent anti-Semitism in the German public. The Nazis will use their SA and SS men to regularly disrupt their meetings. The SA men would show up outside, they'd violently attack the communists, they'd break up their rallies. Though the communists respond, for a lot of people, what you see is a general fear of communism, which manifests itself in support of the Nazis. And no greater group manifests this than big industrialists or people who own large businesses. If you own a large business, the concept of the communists coming to power, taking that business from you, redistributing your wealth from you and giving it to all the other people, and then effectively taking over what you've worked your entire life for, isn't necessarily appealing whatsoever. As sort of the crisis deepens and things worry, big businesses, the ones that aren't, still kicking during the Depression, of course, which are many, believe it or not, start to turn their support to the Nazis. And they start to finance the Nazi campaign with huge sums of money, which allow them to, A, fly Hitler all over Germany, amongst other things, okay? And this is all in order to prevent the communists from taking power. So there's a little bit of a protest vote here, and a little bit of, these guys will protect us, I might not like them, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend. An example of sort of the type of street fighting is this picture, clearly taken from a rooftop, of communists and Nazis in the early 1930s. And this type of chaos would have horrified Germans on a regular basis. This is mass brutality in the streets, and this is not something that the ordered traditional German society likes. And contrastingly, the Nazis, by taking part in winning this, can show that they are able to suppress the chaos. One of the fourth ones, and this is quite important, of course, is political maneuvering. Okay, and what does that mean? Well, let's take a look at what Hitler and the Nazis do. Now, by July of 1932, unemployment nears 6 million in Germany. The Nazis will become the largest party in the Reichstag in a July 1932 election, polling more than 13 million votes, based largely on the things I just talked about. Normally, at this particular time, the leader of the largest party in the Reichstag could expect to be invited to become chancellor by the president, who at this case is Hindenburg, having won again in 1932. But Hindenburg had no intention of appointing a man he hated. And of course, in a time of presidential government, he doesn't have to. He called Hitler a vulgar little corporal, referring, of course, to Hitler's status in the First World War as a mere corporal, a very low-down rank, whereas Hindenburg himself was a general and someone who would consider himself above in every way an Austrian and a corporal. Instead, what we see is that Hindenburg appoints Catholic Center Party leader, a man named Franz von Papen, to the position of chancellorship. Now, Hitler had, to put it in perspective, around 37.5% of the German population voting for him. Franz von Papen never polls above 20%, but von Papen is a little bit of a moderate. He believes that von Papen can perhaps control Hitler in this particular situation, and he's much more palatable, okay, much more of an ideal person to take this role than, of course, the vulgar little corporal. Von Papen isn't able to establish a stable coalition government. The Nazis refuse to take part. Hitler famously says, "Give me the chancellorship or I will take nothing." And because they don't take part, you have a huge section of the German electorate unrepresented in the Reichstag. And as a result of this, between July and November, the government can't get off the ground. It can't pass any bills because the Nazis refuse to take part. And therefore, a second general election needs to be called, which is called for November of 1932. So that political maneuvering, that decision by Hitler to not get involved in government, is a very important one because it forces a second general election in the same year, which happens again in November. Now, interestingly enough, the Nazis don't do as well in November 1932. However, their sort of loss in seats is only marginal, and they're still the largest party in the Reichstag, only losing about 3% of the overall vote. Von Papen found it still impossible to form a coalition government, and instead, von Hindenburg, the president, turns to a former army general, a man named Kurt von Schleicher, okay, to become chancellor. And von Schleicher becomes chancellor of Germany in December 1932. It was hoped that the army and the background of von Schleicher would be appealing to the Nazis. He was a far more right-wing figure. His politics sort of aligned with them. However, the Nazis again yet refuse to cooperate. And it becomes clear that von Schleicher, too, is unable to form a coalition, and that can command a majority in the Reichstag and get anything done whatsoever. Now, this leads to a position between, let's say, December 1932 and January 1933, where the government of Germany is up in the air. And it's left to a situation of backroom dealing, which is sometimes known as political intrigue, this sort of people playing behind the scenes, trying to elevate their position, et cetera, et cetera. Von Papen, who was a rival of von Schleicher, began to play the role of power broker. He didn't like von Schleicher, and he wanted to get him out of the picture. He wanted to displace him. And he wanted to return to a position of political influence and power himself. And towards the end of January 1933, he begins to toy with and then approach Hindenburg with the idea that if we can just get rid of von Schleicher, we can put Hitler perhaps in the position of chancellor. But let's put him in the position of chancellor, but give him no members of the cabinet, i.e. Hitler will be the head of state de facto, or rather the head of government, but the people who will help him make the decisions, the cabinet ministers who will surround him, will mostly be non-Nazis. They calculated that without a majority in the Reichstag, the extreme Nazi policies could be resisted. They also calculated that a cabinet led by von Papen would be able to resist and fight back against Hitler's wishes. In other words, von Papen famously said, I will keep that mouse in the corner. Effectively, we will be able to control him. It's a great understatement because he very, very much miscalculates Hitler. So Hitler gets only 3 cabinet positions. He gets Minister of the Interior. He gets another one, which is given to Goering, that is really a minister without profile, an advisor, if you will. And of course, there's himself as head of state. That was thought to be enough to keep Hitler in control. And what happens as a result of this is that on the 30th of January 1933, incredibly, Hitler is appointed chancellor. He wins the elections. Doesn't get a majority, so he doesn't outright win. But that allows him some influence, and he plays that very, very well. But bottom line is this. To say that Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany would be wrong. He was, in fact, appointed. You need to be elected outright. You need over 50%. Of course, things aren't like that in this sort of prop system of proportional government. The president is doing much of the appointing. Nevertheless, by the 30th of January 1933, von Papen convinces President Hindenburg to take a chance on the little corporal because I can control him. And as a result, he does. Hitler takes the chancellorship again, 30 January 1933. And of course, the mistake made by both von Hindenburg and von Papen will play itself out very evidently in the fact that Hitler will become a dictator in a very short period of time. But of course, that sounds like something we'll talk about next lesson. Last thing here, just want to show you a couple quick political cartoons. This is Hitler literally being elevated to the position of chancellor by von Hindenburg and von Papen. It's sort of a British political cartoon which shows that Hitler perhaps should not be underestimated. You can tell that by the way his hands are resting on the heads of von Hindenburg and von Papen, pushing them down while elevating himself, even though ostensibly it is them who are carrying him on his shoulders. Here's the very opposite. This is an American cartoon which suggests that Hitler would be completely destroyed by the job of being chancellor in a government, of course, dominated by Hindenburg, and that being shown by the fact that Hindenburg, represented by the old school World War I German helmet, very commonly worn by President Hindenburg. On that helmet it says German Chancellorship, and that helmet is impaling the stupefied-looking Hitler. Okay, so as the bell indicates, that's all for today. I'll catch you guys up in class, and if you have any questions, again, write them down. Don't hesitate to bring them.